I am Linda Nemec, CEO of Acute Incite, and will be facilitating today's session. Please introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't already. We would love to know who is joining us and where you are joining from. For those of you who don't know us, Acute Incite is a small consulting firm based in the DC area. We specialize in helping companies and organizations lead and adapt through change. Our team and consultants have worked in dynamic environments around the world, helping companies navigate market growth, policy changes, and performance challenges. We combine strategic facilitation, collaborative planning, and access to top-tier trade expertise through our network of specialists, some of whom are online with us today. With decades of experience across diverse markets, these experts have supported exporters, advised on tariffs and custom challenges, and helped businesses adapt to shifting trade conditions around the world. As we all know, trade shifts and policy changes appear to have become the new normal. Businesses face serious risks in understanding the changes and their impact, planning for various scenarios, and being able to adapt quickly are now critical skills for all companies. I've been in touch with dozens of small businesses, many of whom are just trying to stay ahead of cost increases, shipment issues, and compliance risks. What we heard consistently is, we don't need theory, we need practical guidance, and we don't have time to read every update. That's why we pulled this session together. We've brought together 3 experienced voices from the companies TradeMoves and Mercor Consulting and Acute Incite, who can help cut through the complexity and offer real insights and advice. We will start with 3 short presentations and then a panel discussion with questions and answers incorporated from me and from you. From TradeMoves, we have Leo Boccalon, who is a senior international trade analyst there. From Mercor Consulting, Jeff Bensing is the principal and founder of the company. And from Acute Incite, Shannon Gaffney, who is a senior trade consultant. It's important for us to understand who is with us and why you are here today. So let's get to know you. We will use AHA slides twice in today's webinar. Don't worry, it's easy to do. Please follow the link in the chat now or scan the QR code to answer just a couple of quick questions. And the first question is, what type of organization or company do you work for or have you worked for? And choose your category. I think you can see them, but professional services, manufacturing, automotive, healthcare, finance, supply chain, transportation, and logistics, and of course, other. Okay. Answers are coming in. All right, this is a nice mix. So it looks like about half the people professional services, but then we have a mix of other and some manufacturing and finance. Terrific. Next question, what do you hope to get out of today's webinar? Right, answers are coming in. Did somebody mean to put a frowny face sliding through the slides? Okay. All right, trending insights, better understanding of volatility in companies, information, what needs are out there, hear the latest insights on tariffs, trade, and how markets are adjusting, general update on the tariff situation, insights on strategies during current unstable times, and tips on how to think through the impact of tariffs, tools and approaches to monitor tariff changes. And I'm going to stop there, but that is a lot. And hopefully we get a lot of it covered, and we can always provide you the contact information so we can follow up if needed. All right, so now let's get started with our presenters. Please put any questions you have during the presentation in the chat, and we will integrate them into the panel later. All right. So Leo Boccalon is a senior trade specialist at TradeMoves, where he helps U.S. companies navigate complex tariff policies, import regulations, and evolving trade actions. It's a very timely job to have. He specializes in providing practical, business-relevant analysis that supports sourcing, compliance, and market access decisions. He brings a strong understanding of global trade dynamics and a sharp focus on how policy changes affect U.S. businesses operating across borders. Leo.
Well, first of all, thank you, Linda, for all those participating. I'm part of TradeMoves. We're a team of cross-border trade analysts who advise our clients in global operations, particularly in the space of food and ag, but also have plenty of experience with manufacturers, machinery, and the aerospace industry. To get us started, I would like to first level set on a couple points to provide some helpful context. The first point that I think we need to level set on is trying to understand why trade matters, particularly for small and medium companies. In 2024, U.S. cross-border trade in goods was valued at $5 trillion, or 2/3 of which could be noted as imports. And even though our conversation today is going to be focused primarily on the import side, I think it's important to also acknowledge exports, of which were valued at $1.7 trillion in 2024. For the purposes of our conversation, this means a few things. First, the US continues to be dependent on foreign sourcing, and that's for both finished goods for consumers as well as critical inputs for US manufacturers. Two, for all businesses, including small and medium companies, it is important, and I would say critical, that they find new opportunities in foreign markets. This is a particularly salient point when you consider that 95% of consumers live outside the United States. And finally, tariffs on imports into the US or on US exports into foreign markets do and will have an impact on these companies and consumers, given the magnitude of trade. The second issue I would like to align on is to get an understanding of where we started on day one of the Trump administration. Within the first 24 hours of President Trump coming into office, he signed the America First trade policy, which is a comprehensive framework to manage America's trade relationship with the rest of the world. The executive order focuses on three pillars. The first being unfair and unbalanced trade by any trading partner. Two, economic and trade relations with China. And three, other economic security matters. And then in terms of strategies, what's important to emphasize is that the executive order places an emphasis on tariffs as a preferred approach to transform the US and global trade environment. Having level set on these two particular issues, so why we're discussing trade and where trade policy began on day one of Trump 2.0, we can better appreciate where we stand over 100 days into the second Trump administration. After 4 months of being in office, President Trump has enacted over 25 different trade and tariff actions. This slide tries to summarize some of those actions that have either been proposed or implemented, but truly what it does is illustrate the onslaught of activity in just 4 months. These trade actions are unprecedented in numerous ways, right? One, it targets some of America's most important trade partners, including China, Canada, and Mexico. It also targets some of the most important sectors in our country, particularly pharmaceuticals, autos, steel, and aluminum. For reciprocal tariffs, it's the magnitude and the broadness and scope that truly is unprecedented. And finally, it's the legal authorities that the administration has leveraged to justify these actions that are of particular importance, such as the use of Section 301 during the first Trump administration, and then during the second Trump administration, the use of Section 232 and the International Emergencies Economics Powers Act, or IEPA. So with such unprecedented action, it's no surprise that the domestic and foreign response has been equally as dynamic and impactful. On the domestic side, I would say that responses can be categorized into two different buckets. The first being legal action taken against the Trump tariffs. As of today, there are 7 different lawsuits in courts who are targeting tariffs implemented by Trump. And they have different arguments that they're promoting. The first being that these tariffs are actually a violation of the separation of powers between Congress and the executive branch, are an overreach of the jurisdiction of the president, or they would cause irreparable economic harm to these businesses. And I would also highlight what's important is that the plaintiffs of these cases are not just private businesses. They also include states, such as California, which is the US state with the largest value of imports in the country. The second bucket that you can categorize some of these domestic responses is legislative initiatives within Congress that seek to limit presidential authority and tariffs. However, the reality is that these legislative actions are less likely to succeed than the litigation, as they require sufficient votes to overcome an almost certain veto by the president. And then on the foreign side, we also have a range of responses by different trading partners, right? And they start from tit for tat retaliation all the way out to negotiations and collaboration with the Trump administration. In terms of retaliation, we have China and Canada, who they themselves have implemented tariffs of their own against exports from the United States. With China implementing what I would label as more broad tit for tat retaliation, and Canada taking a more strategic, tailored approach by targeting very specific products from the United States. But there's also Mexico and the UK, which are the complete opposite, which I would label as having a more conciliatory tone in response to the Trump administration's tariff actions. Both countries have really emphasized collaboration with Trump to try to avoid the worst of tariff actions. Most recently, we had the UK signing a deal with the United States. But I would also caution in trying to understand, the impact of that deal, as there's still a lot of details pending. So it's really hard to determine how comprehensive, that type of collaboration will be in the long term. So I would say with that overview of the trade environment and where we stand today, I'm just gonna pass it back on to Linda so we can dive into a little more of the operational side of these tariffs and trade actions.
Thank you, Leo. But before then, let me just encourage people to put any questions, I'm sure there probably are a few of them, in the chat, okay? Great. Jeff Benson is our next speaker. He is the principal and founder of Mercor Consulting with more than 30 years of experience in global customs and trade. He works with companies to design and implement customs compliance programs, manage sourcing risks, and strengthen supply chain security. Jeff previously served as Global Customs and Trade Manager at the International Trade Services Corporation, and he spent 8 years with the U.S. Customs Service. He brings both public and private sector perspective to the challenges facing businesses right now, from tariff exposure to operational bottlenecks, and he helps clients stay compliant, competitive, and prepared. Jeff.
Great. Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Leo, for setting the stage, and all of you for joining us today. Let's dig into some of the details about tariffs. To start, there are a few core concepts we want to share with you. Tariffs are taxes charged on goods imported from other countries. This cost may ultimately fall on the manufacturer, the importer, or the ultimate consumer, but someone has to cover the extra cost. The importer of record is liable for paying tariffs on imported goods. At the border, US CBP requires that importers pay the tariffs. And if they don't, CBP goes after the customs bond all importers are required to maintain. But someone has to maintain. The bond issuer then goes back to the importer with the bill. So ultimately, the importer is going to get that bill one way or another. Importers and exporters must agree on mutual tariff cost sharing. It's far better to address cost sharing before the bill has come due. Importers must understand full cost of tariffs for accurate business planning. I've had many calls recently from importers seeking to address large, unexpected duty charges. Once your broker has filed the entry, it's generally too late to do anything about the duty rate. Let's address US tariffs in place. For a long time, importers operated in a low tariff world, around 3% average with many goods at 0%. Where tariff rates changes were systematic, incremental, and tariffs got generally lower over time. This is the green zone on the chart. Over the past decade, trade tensions contributed to increases in applied tariffs through various processes, but those increases continued to be systematic and somewhat predictable. This was the blue zone. In the current environment, tariffs are increased and sometimes temporarily pulled back in a rapid, chaotic, and unpredictable ways. This is the current red zone. As you can see, we have, and this was covered by Leo, we've had many new tariff programs put in place. Some existing ones have been leveraged, like Section 232. Some new ones have been used, like IEEPA, and that's been used in multiple ways. And for an example, this China tariff on the far right, on the chart it says 125%, but as you likely know, there's been a truce declared, so that 125% rate has temporarily been set to 30%. But how long that truce holds is unknowable. So we went from a relatively predictable green zone where things change slowly to one where things change rapidly or unpredictable. So you have to really adapt your business practices to be able to support that. Stackability of tariffs. I'm not going to address the specifics of this slide, but want to use it to illustrate the complexity of the current tariff environment. It is very challenging to identify which tariffs are applied, which are exempted, and what the stacked total you have to pay is. Also, due to policy changes, the total could change before an import order is processed, shipped, and entered into the US. It takes 30 days to cross from China or Asia, and things can change completely. And that's not the environment most importers are used to dealing with. For an example, on May 16th, new guidance was applied about the stackability of 232 and IEEPA tariffs. I know for recent shipments, some importers paid both, but they should now be eligible for refunds. But there's no way they could plan that. They've come to me and they said, why am I paying 10% and 25%? And on a large shipment, that could be tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. Generally, once your goods are in transit, the tariff is locked in. But that is not a certainty in this policy environment. And customs is completely overwhelmed. I've seen them making mistakes when things are specifically applied, when duty rates kick in, how they're processing refunds. So again, we're just in a very challenging environment from how much you have to pay and knowing what it's going to be. I'm going to look at some examples or provide some examples of different tariff products. So let's look at stainless steel ingots. If you look on the left side of the slide, we have the MFN rate, which was free. We have a preferential rate, which is possibly free for Canada under USMCA. There's a new UK trade deal that may or may not provide duty-free access. For China, there are no options. We have Section 232 duties. In this case, 25% applies to all of the parties. For China, there's an additional 301 duty, which is often 7.5% or 25%. There's an IEEPA duty for fentanyl of 20% that applies to China. And then we have the reciprocal tariffs. So in the case of Canada and the UK, the reciprocal tariff is exempt due to the fact that they've already applied a 232 tariff. They're not doing that for China. So if you look at the very bottom, we have for Canada, for this steel product, 25% are free. For the UK, 25% or possibly free. And for China, a nice hefty 80%. So let's look at the solid state drive. I'm sorry, let's jump back to the previous slide. I'll run through these kind of quickly. You have Mexico and you have the possibility of USMCA, so that's free. With China, again, you have a whole series of stacked duties that add up to quite a bit. With South Korea, you have a relatively reasonable rate, but there's a suspended alternative reciprocal of 26%. So we don't know if that's going to be put in place or not. It really depends on if a trade deal is developed. And for vanilla, you have a very similar situation. You don't have from Madagascar, Uganda, and Indonesia, you don't have those other 301 or 232 because not that product doesn't apply to, but you do have the 10% and potentially pretty high rates of 47 and 32%. So just showing the complexity and the breadth of these duties. Possible tariff mitigation strategies. There are a number of tariff mitigation strategies available. They're generally not going to avoid the tariffs, but they can help limit the damage. I'm just going to highlight a few of them. Confirm imported goods are properly classified. So if your goods are properly classified, you can go through these charts or seek advisors, and they can tell you what the duty rate is and what it's likely to be. But if you made mistakes in that, you're going to have no idea what's going on. So it's more important than ever. In the old environment where many goods were zero duty rate, classification was important, but not as important. But now I think it's the bedrock of understanding what you're going to have to be dealing with. From a sourcing and supply chain perspective, one of the options is to stockpile goods in advance. So where we have these pauses, and this has been happening, and it's one of the reasons the economy seems to be holding up, is there's been a lot of rushing shipments into the US. You can also use this time to negotiate with suppliers and customers to cost share new tariffs. There's different people that can pay it. It can be paid by the manufacturer, it can be paid by the importer, it can be paid by the ultimate customer. And a lot of companies are trying to negotiate, a balance of those things. Diversify your suppliers. If you're supplied primarily by a country that is potentially currently subject or potentially subject to these really high duty rates, you might want to look at some other options. Sales and valuation. Ensure costs which are not dutiable are excluded from the import value. So customs value has some very specific approaches, and in the US, certain things are excluded from that value. And so you really want to look at that. You get only declare to customs what the required value is and make sure you can back it up. That means you pay the minimum duty, and if customs comes back to you and questions it, you have support for why you're doing it that way. Advocacy and engagement. Now, there used to be kind of a model that we talked about where these things happen slowly. There was opportunity for input. You could go to your congressman. That's much more limited now, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't still do it. And in particular, there has been some success at advocating for exemptions. So I think using your ability through your industry, through your political bodies, you should seek tariff reductions where you can, at least give it a try. Importance of customs compliance. CBP is focusing much more on enforcement. Their job is to facilitate legitimate trade, enforce customs laws, and ensure proper tariff revenue. In recent years, they've been using much more data-centric approach to risk assessment, and they're also seeking greater visibility into the supply chain. And some of this is quite intrusive, but they've gotten better at using data, and their mission is now less facilitate legitimate trade and more ensure proper tariff revenue. So they're using those resources to make sure that happens. I just want to kind of highlight a couple facts. They're definitely aware of the standard approaches to getting around paying duties and are looking for patterns. They're getting better at using data analytics to identify non-compliance and duty avoidance, particularly through transshipment and undervaluation. With increased tariffs comes greater risk of being fined and penalized for failure to pay duties. So it's one thing if you do it by accident, you can get fined pretty heavily, but if they feel you've deliberately avoided the duties, the penalties can be double or triple or more of the duties that are lost or the cost of the goods. Some key defensive steps. I'm sorry, let's jump back. On the right side, ensure accurate country of origin. We talked about this a little bit. Make sure you know where your goods are classified and where that origin is. And there's a whole series of concepts around origin that you need to follow. Ensure declared value represents the price paid or payable. Make sure that your price is defendable under customs rules. Just a note, easy solutions are almost always too good to be true. There's people out there offering to transship goods to do various things and not have the duties applied. You really want to look at that very closely. You're potentially putting yourself at great risk. Couple of key takeaways. America First trade policy is a systematic overhaul in dealing with U.S. trade partners. As Leo mentioned, this is a global situation. And not only do you have U.S. tariffs going in place and being taken back and then put back on, other countries are doing the same. So you have a global environment where tariffs have become much more important to the process. Application of new tariffs is not systematic, is poorly communicated, and exceedingly difficult to predict. Because of all this churn, it's really hard to know what's going to happen tomorrow, next week, or next month. New tariffs are here, more likely coming. I think this gets lost a little bit in the mix, but the fact that even if these very high reciprocal tariffs don't get applied or things are pulled back from China, 10% around the world is a 300% increase over the old average of 3%. So tariffs are here to stay, and they're much higher than they used to be. A highly dynamic phase through the foreseeable future with new announcements continuing at a rapid clip. We kind of covered this. Information is coming at a rapid pace. It's put out, it's withdrawn, it's put back out. You got to really keep track of what's going on. Continued uncertainty and unpredictability for businesses about full scope of tariff cost exposure. Because of the stackability issues, because of the changing tariffs that could be applied, it's really hard to know what you're going to end up paying. And I've had a bunch of clients come to me and shocked that they had pretty major bills and asking what to do about it. And unfortunately, it's often too late at that point. Legal challenges, trade actions may or may not impact the tariffs applied on U.S. imports. There are a lot of court cases out there. They're challenging these tariffs. Who knows what's going to happen, but you have to kind of look at the worst case scenario and maybe hope for a slightly better one. It's critical to understand supply chain, identify tariff cost risk, explore and validate tariff mitigation strategies. So you want to apply all of the kind of skill sets to make this as the best environment you can in a difficult circumstance. And I think a lot of that is understanding what the rules are, understanding what your products are, communicating well with your sources and your customers, and trying to find the path through this that is best as possible. And that wraps up my comments.
Thank you, Jeff. Much appreciated. We will now hear from Shannon from Acute Incite.
Great. Thanks, Linda. And thanks everyone for being here. So I'm going to piggyback on a lot of what Leo and Jeff have laid out for you, but really what you just heard about sourcing decisions, customs enforcement, and how quickly the rules can shift really underlines exactly why this conversation is so important. The pace of change is unprecedented. According to the Washington Post, the Trump administration has implemented more than 50 tariff policy actions this year, with some of them reversed the next day. So that kind of churn creates really deep uncertainty, and especially for small businesses that don't have a large trade compliance team to rely on. Volatility in general, of course, makes it a lot harder for anyone to build a pricing model, secure financing, or sign supplier contracts with confidence. For small and mid-sized companies, trade policy isn't an abstract issue. We understand it's this quarter's pricing model, it's next quarter's inventory, or a shipment stuck at the port. And as Leo and Jeff have laid out very comprehensively, the trade landscape is in flux. While the administration recently paused the highest China tariffs for 90 days, that doesn't mean the pressure is lifted. It just means we now have a very brief window to prepare ourselves for what's next. But even temporary pauses can be misleading. Section 232 and 301 tariffs remain in place. And there are broader trends: friendshoring, industrial policy, retaliatory trade actions. All of these factors are reshaping the rules of engagement on a global scale. As you well know, for small businesses, these shifts don't just affect your margins. They affect hiring, sourcing, pricing, shipping, and just your ability to compete in the marketplace. Unfortunately, I don't think we're in a moment of a temporary disruption. We are operating in a time of structural change. Trade tools are being re-engineered in real time with little warning. This, to me, represents a long-term shift in how trade is being used as a strategic lever. For companies, unfortunately, that's also turned trade policy into a moving target. And so in this environment, treating trade as just a compliance issue isn't enough. It's really a strategic issue, one that touches procurement, operations, sales, and even client relationships. So what can smaller companies do, especially without a large in-house trade team or expensive advisors on call? I'm so glad you asked. I'd like to walk you through 3 practical steps from our experience helping companies operate in complex, high-risk environments. Step 1, map your risk. And this can be simple and strategic. You don't need a 50-page report. Start by identifying which products, vendors, and markets are most exposed to tariffs, to regulatory shifts, or to shipping volatility. For example, if a key input comes from China and tariffs snap back to 145%, what's the cost impact? Or if you're exporting food products and you need to shift to a new market, can you quickly adjust to meet their labeling standards? Even core sectors like motor vehicles and agriculture have seen tariff policy reversed multiple times. If it's happening to them, it could easily happen to you. So mapping risk isn't optional. It's actually your first line of defense. And it doesn't have to be overly complicated. It just needs to be something practical and actionable. So step 2 is to stay informed, but with a caveat. Manage your information diet. Like you, I see headlines flying every day, and I sometimes get overwhelmed by everything that's inundating my inbox, my social media, and every screen around me. So in order to keep things focused and to really understand the signal rather than the noise, I would recommend several things. First, subscribe to 1 or 2 key industry updates and skim policy alerts maybe on a weekly basis. And then talk to people in your peers or in your supply chain. Ask your freight forwarders, suppliers, what they're observing, what has them worried, and what they're exploring as mitigation strategies. So you don't need a full-time trade analyst. You just need a rhythm for staying on top of new developments. Step 3 is to plan for optionality. Even a rough plan B gives you some leverage. Which alternate suppliers could you call? Could you shift your sourcing or pricing strategy if a major tariff hits? Simple what-if scenarios like these can help you act quickly when conditions shift. In this case, optionality is resilience. For example, many companies are already planning or in the process of front-loading inventory during this 90-day pause on some of the China tariffs. But this rush, of course, creates its own challenges with shipping capacity and logistics costs. So having contingency plans for both scenarios, whether tariffs return to higher levels or not, gives you strategic flexibility. Next slide, please. So these are really the key takeaways. Trade policy, as we've all said, will continue to be volatile, and unfortunately, unpredictability is our new normal. But you are not powerless. And I cannot emphasize this enough. As Jeff was also saying, use your voice. Many companies assume that they don't have any influence, but we have seen small and medium-sized firms successfully obtain tariff exclusions or influence policy by documenting the impact of the policies and speaking through associations or trade coalitions. As a reminder, the United States has 30 million small and medium-sized businesses that employ 50% of the private sector workforce. You are an important constituency. Still confused? We've put together a downloadable guide to support you in this process called Navigating Trade Uncertainty. And it's designed to help you very quickly assess your exposure and then identify your next step. So you don't have to be a policy expert, but in this environment, having a plan is really non-negotiable. Thanks again, everyone, for being here. And thanks to Leo, Jeff, and Acute Incite for making this important conversation possible.
A big thank you to our speakers. I have a few questions for them, and I see that the audience has a number of questions for them, and they probably have some questions for each other. So let me get to a couple what may be pressing questions from these last speakers. Jeff, there is a question here directed to you that says, when you say 25% or free, could you further explain how an importer would know which it is? And I'm not sure what slide that comes from, but
Sure.
if anybody
Yeah.
wants to raise their hand and explain, that's fine. But go ahead.
Well, yeah, Linda, I do understand where it comes from. So,
Oh.
because the only game in town for free right now is USMCA. So that's the US Canada Mexico agreement. So your goods would have to qualify under that preferential trade agreement as a good of the US, Mexico, or Canada. And that is done through a certificate of origin or that identifies that those goods qualify. And there's specific criteria required for that, primarily tariff shift, as well as some value-added rules. But so that's a pre-existing program that was negotiated. Trump initially, kind of said it wasn't going to apply, but then retracted that and is applying it. So you have to have the goods basically manufactured with components in one of the three countries and qualify through a certificate of origin, a USMCA certificate.
Great, thank you so much. Here's another one. Can you give an example of a tariff in the past that had beneficial effects for U.S. industry or sector, as well as the overall economy? And maybe I'll direct this to Leo.
Yeah, happy to answer. And I think it's a great question. I know, I think Shannon commented that you have to go back to I think it was 1980s to see examples, but I would actually say you could go back to the Trump first administration to provide an example that might answer that question, particularly the tariffs on washing machines, right? So during the first Trump administration, he implemented tariffs on the import of washing machines upon the request of Whirlpool. And I think what's interesting is that, first of all, in terms of determining whether it was successful, I think that's a matter of opinion, and I think it's about defining what success means, right? So based on research from the University of Chicago and the Federal Reserve, those tariffs actually allowed for, I believe it was over 1,000 new jobs in the industry, and for foreign manufacturers of washing machines to invest in the country. However, that same research also identified that those jobs came at a cost over $800,000 per job, and consumers actually ended up paying more. So if you define success as increased jobs, they were successful, but it did come at a cost, and it's not really just the rosy picture is not really there. So in terms of what it means for us today, what I'm worried about is that the Trump administration hasn't necessarily clearly defined what it wants to do with tariffs and what that outlook or what the final output's supposed to be. And without that, we are entering a very ambiguous environment where tariffs, particularly really broad tariffs, might bring a lot more negative impact than it's really worth.
Leo, let me build on that a little bit. And I think it's obvious we have some free trade tendencies, but there are and were existing programs to address some of these things. And there's no denying that other competitors in some cases disadvantaged U.S. companies through their processes, particularly China. So you have a program called the Anti-Dumping Countervailing Duty Program, which has been around for many decades, which allowed for very specific targeted duties, and sometimes they were hundreds of percent, after an investigation and a process, and where industry, both U.S. industry impacted and the importers had the opportunity to provide input, where there was a recognition that something was subsidized or sold below cost. There were other programs in place first, but they tended to be systematic. They advertised what they wanted to do. They allowed a lot of contribution by the various affected parties, and then put those in place. So the difference now is like all of that seems to have been thrown out the window. And I think that's where you see our outrage is we know businesses want predictability and opportunity to adjust. So the other aspect of these things is the very rapid way they've been put in place really makes it impossible to plan.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. I have another question. This one to Shannon. How do you gather and manage information and keep up with all the changes? You provided some advice, but do you have any other tips?
I do. I mean, I think it's hard to answer that sort of in the abstract. I think it really depends on sort of what sector you're in. But I think there are sort of sources that I tend to go to. I mean, if you're looking for sort of, they're in buckets, right? So there's like some official government sources, USTR, CBP.gov. U.S. International Trade Commission has a lot of great information and analysis of some of these topics. I think that the good news of having kind of a Republican administration, Democrats kind of stepped away from trade. Biden certainly did. So trade is in the headlines very prominently in a lot of news sources. So Reuters, Bloomberg, Politico Trade. There's also a subscription service called Inside US Trade that has a lot of great information. And then there's sort of practical tools like some of the big law firms, Sandler, Travis, Rosenberg, puts out kind of publications about analyzing impact of different trade policies. There's also something that I came across sort of recently called tradeandborders.com, where they're kind of looking at what is the impact and tracking, Trade 2.0 tariff information. So there's a lot out there. I think, obviously it depends, of course, on what your needs are and which industry you're in. Whatever seems to be the right kind of angle that you need. I can follow up with you perhaps on more specifics.
Okay.
And Shannon, to build on that a little bit, also the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Office of Trade, and other parties have been putting out some pretty impressive summaries and publications. So there are customs bulletins that are the official positions, but they've put out supplemental information too. And I know from personal knowledge that they work through the weekends, like literally 24 hours before some of these things happen, to scramble and get this information out. Now they are making some mistakes, but it's actually pretty amazing that they update their systems and processes and put out this information in as timely a manner as they do.
Great, thank you. Leo, I think this one might be for you, but also Jeff. So I really want to talk about the uncertainty around shipping. So what are you seeing could be the consequences of tariff changes on shipping?
Yeah, I can definitely get us started, and Jeff can dive into a little bit more of the operational details. I think what I would add is that just given how the policy is being developed, there's not a lot of clarity coming from the top to bottom in terms of how these tariffs are being applied and in line with when items are being shipped and put in the water. So there's a lot of ambiguity and unclarity as to what the impacts are. A lot of the information is coming after the fact, after the tariffs are implemented, and when actual policymakers can figure out what are the details. So that being said, I mean, I'll let Jeff speak to the details, but we're trying to stay up to date as much as we can with CMS reports from CBP as that information comes out, be able to communicate it in real time.
Yes. Great.
No, and I think there's a couple aspects of this. I saw that there was a question related to when the tariffs are applied, and if say there's a new tariffs put back in place, the really high rates. So generally, it's been if it's loaded onto the ship, it is then not applied. That duty rate isn't applied. But Customs does put out the announcement of the date of implementation. So you can identify when this is going to be put in place and where they've made mistakes or where you can identify that your goods were in transit. I do know that they've offered some refunds. And if you talk about the general environment, we probably remember during the pandemic when there were 100 ships stacked outside of LA Long Beach. Just anecdotally, there's been apparently days when there are no ships coming into LA Long Beach in recent days. So, this is going to have a big impact on the cost of shipment. And it's kind of difficult to know because it may seem like, oh, I'm going to get it cheaper. But then if there aren't ships in the right places or boxes in the right places or staff to address it, those rates could go up. So, I mean, I think you want to work very closely with your shippers to kind of, and a lot of them put out publications and information. There's a lot of good resources to follow where a rate's headed, what is the fill rate of shipments, where are things loading up or dropping off.
Here's an interesting question from Munir, and he's asking, the levy is 20% on goods, but it's more complicated in his country. There are 3 trade regimes in there, and some of the tariffs are 0%. So, what are the options? I mean, basically, how did he come up with 20%? And what can be done?
Linda, is this inbound into the US or a different country?
Munir, do you want to go off mute and further
Yes, I would love to. Yes, I actually was taking your permission to do that. Well, it is as simple as that. When the Trump administration came up with all these 140%, 145, 20%, 10%, this country 35, how did they come up with these percentages? From where, what the study it made them say that this country is I know a country that the Trump administration put, I live in the MENA region, and I also teach customs facilitations, customs procedures and trade facilitation in the MENA region and in Central Asia. So one of the countries in the MENA region, I know they may levy more than 30 or 40% on US goods, but not it is not against you on the US. It's they are called non-tariff duties or non-tariff it's like my country, we have non-tariff duties, but it is not against the US. This is the question. How did they say? You understand me? They came up with percentages, and we have 0 actually tariff on all US goods. All US goods, it's 0 tariff. If we have a non-tariff duty, it's only for all the countries, not only for US. We are not against US. This is my question. How did they come up with these tariffs? They said Egypt is 10, Jordan is 20, Morocco is 10, China is 145. How did they come up with that?
Thank you, Munir.
There's
Thank
an
you.
awful lot there.
Thank you. It's a lovely debate. I learned a lot, and I thank you.
Jeff.
I can start out, and I'm sure everyone else has something to add. And I'm going to try to pick a couple of the key elements there. So one is we used to have most favored nation, which was a multilateral trading system that was used through the World Trade Organization and implemented by the World Customs Organization. So that is dead, or at least on life support. So that process that was, decade-long rounds at the WTO in negotiations, and the goal was to lower tariffs. So at least for now, that's over. So we have reciprocal tariffs. Now, the way these were developed, and I'm not going to say this exactly right, you should Google it. But by rumor, it was ChatGPT. But what they actually did was take the trade deficit and do some math to it. And this was the trade deficit in goods. So the higher the trade deficit against the US was, the higher your tariff rates are. And that's how some developing countries ended up with really high rates, but just by circumstance, the US was importing a lot more from them than it was exporting. And you have some of these outrageous rates. But they used a relatively unsophisticated formula, by my interpretation, that actually isn't tied to anything but the trade deficit. And I'm sure more people have to add to that. So.
Thank you.
I would only, if I could
You know
just
what?
add,
I actually need to go to the last question. We are running out of time. What are the three main pain points clients have due to recent volatility that they seek assistance and advice on? Let me start with Leo.
you just it cut off on my end. Can you repeat that one more
Yeah.
time?
What are the three main pain points
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
people are asking about given what's going on?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's very context specific, right? Based on the industry, on the business. But I think generally speaking is first, in terms of business planning, right? You can't really understand what's going to happen or the decision. You can't make the decisions for the future if you don't know what's currently happening. So I think that's one primary pain point is the business planning or an inability to do that. And I think the second is just being able to, communicate, to your customers what this impact has on your business and to them and their cost. If you don't understand what the tariffs are going to be on the long term, you can't make those adjustments to the prices and eventually, adjust what that reflects to the actual consumer. So I would say that that's sort of the two primary focuses, but also it very depends on the client and the industry.
Thanks so much, Leo. I'm afraid we're going to have to move on, but we will see if we can get these questions answered post webinar. So thank you, everyone, for some really great questions and participation. Much appreciated. So let's go back to the AHA slides. Please follow the link in the chat or scan the QR code again to answer one more quick question to help us close out the webinar. Based on what you've learned today, what is one of the first challenges you want to tackle? And as you're answering that, and we wrap up, I'd like to thank Leo, Jeff, and Shannon. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights with us. And if you need more in-depth information from them or would like support tailored to your business, feel free to reach out to any of our speakers. And we have their contact information. Well, the next slide will have the contact information listed. So what is coming up in the AHA slides? All right, analyze the main areas of risk. What are the economic and business impacts of the tariffs issued for key countries? Okay. All right. All right. Well, thank you for everyone who's joined today. By the end of the week, you will see a follow-up email from Acute Incite, probably me, with speaker contact information, the slide deck, and our Navigating Trade Uncertainty Guide. On behalf of Acute Incite and TradeMoves and Merkur Consulting, I just want to thank you again. And thanks for some really great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get them to all of them. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.